the Ohio Genealogical Society. I'd like to welcome you to this brief little webinar on researching house histories only using basically exclusively online sources, and how you can actually flesh out the history of a house and the families and lives of the people that lived in them by using a number of tools that are at your disposal very readily from your home. And so a couple of reminders for you. I appreciate if you could keep your microphones muted during the presentation. I get easily distracted by dog barks because I like dogs, so I don't want to hear your dogs barking and stuff like that, or your phone and stuff like that. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and it will be available at a later date on the OGS website. I am hoping also to provide a link to that, to the PowerPoint I'm giving right now on that page once it goes live. If you or your organization that you belong to are interested in sponsoring OGS webinars, we would love to have that sponsorship. You can email me at the email address you see there, or you can just email me through ogs@ogs.org. So don't get excited by my slides because there won't be that many graphics. One of the things I do, I live in the city of New Philadelphia, Ohio, which is, I love it here. It's a wonderful walking town. I walk around my neighborhood. I live right downtown. So I walk around town all the time, and I always see a house, or I don't see a house, or I see something that I really want to know more about. And so I tend to write about it. This is a house that I wrote about not too long ago, which actually doesn't even exist anymore. If you walk to where this house is, I actually discovered this house on Google Street View. So, but this is what it looked like in 1908. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at some tools that are there, some goals, some resources that you can use when you're researching a house history and you have no desire whatsoever to spend any time in a courthouse or in a library. So all the resources I'm going to show you are essentially available to you online. I should tell you how I started doing this kind of work, because I started doing this work more traditionally as a historian. I worked for about 14 years for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation in Williamsburg, Virginia. And if you've ever visited Colonial Williamsburg, you know that it is a real town, it's a real city that was restored in the early 20th century by the Rockefellers, and now looks the way it once did back in the 1770s, with the reconstruction of hundreds of buildings, the preservation of about 100 buildings. When I worked there, my job was to research buildings themselves and building construction. And then also I conducted site research for the Department of Historic Trades on sites within the confines of the historic area where there might have been tradesmen working and living. So I did a lot of site histories in a very traditional way by going to the library, going to the courthouse, and trying to trace the history of sites within the historic area so that I could figure out who lived there and who worked in those areas. Those skills are wonderful, and I will preface this whole talk by saying that there is no substitute for going to a library or courthouse if you really want to flesh out a site history or house history. But what you can do with these tools is provide the framework on which you might want to hang a larger kind of study. I have also done in the past and continue to do National Register nominations for properties, which involves more research in physical places. Nothing I'm doing here would really qualify for that kind of research. But this is where I got my start. You can go to my website, which is Noel-Poirier or Noel-Poirier.com, where you can read some of these site histories I've written for Colonial Williamsburg if you can choose. This is my website. Because I am a historian and I have that kind of itch to scratch in my free time, which is not much. I try to write histories of houses in my community here in Tuscarawas County. I focus a lot on New Philadelphia, but I write about other communities in Tuscarawas County as well. I joke about this site when I talk about these histories that I am really the lazy historian because I don't like to leave the office I'm in right now on my own. If I can avoid going to a courthouse or a library to do a lot of in-depth research and can find the resources I need and the tools that I need, I will do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover some of those goals. This is what we're going to cover, actually. We're going to talk about what is our goal for this kind of research, what are the tools that are available to us, what are some sources, and those stories. And then I will, if there's time, what I'll do is I'll give you kind of an example that I'm working on right now, so you can see kind of how I've gone about that process right now. So first of all, we're not writing a doctoral dissertation, right? That's not what the purpose of this effort is. What we're trying to do is simply get some history on a house that we can hang a lot of other things on. So if you want to write a doctoral dissertation, or if you'd like to read one, a long one that I've written, you can go to the Colonial Williamsburg website and read the history of the Public Armory site, which is about a 30-page, 40-page, heavily footnoted, dull rendition of how that building was constructed and who was working. But that's not the goal for this. Our goal here is basically you found a house, or it's a family house perhaps, and you'd like to know a little bit more about maybe when it was built, who might have lived in it prior to your family, or who in your family had lived there. You might want to know what kind of architectural style it is, those kind of things, or look at its development over time. How did it change over time, right? So those are really the goals. They're much simpler than just simply doing a National Register of Historic Places nomination. We're not doing that with these kind of tools. So for starters, basic tool you need is a library card, right? And my public library here, I think, loves the fact that this is how I start all these talks about doing research. Get a library card, because in Ohio, for most public libraries, that library card will provide you access to a lot of online databases and resources that you might otherwise have to pay for. Now, those resources may not be as comprehensive as what you would get if you were paying for them, but they're there and you can take advantage of them. I actually know my public library card ID number by memory because I type it in so much doing research. So it's one of those things that you really want to make sure that you get a library card. You don't have to leave, you just got to get a library card. The other thing you need is a 1990s PC, right? Or whatever you might happen to have. I love this. This is like the one I had on my desk when I was in college. It's huge. But I'm plugging my own local library on the screen, which is the customer public library system. You have a library card, you have access to the internet, you can do everything we're going to talk about today. So where do you start? Like I said, for my experiences, of course, I have my house that I live in, built in the 1850s by a gentleman named Samuel Crossland, lived from 1876 to 1906 by a gentleman named Abraham W. Patrick, who was a judge, state senator, was a vice presidential nominee, or on the ballot for the vice presidential nominee in 1900. Very prominent local gentleman. And then it was lived in after Abraham Patrick by a wonderful family called the Marshes. Florence Marsh was the founder of the suffragist movement in Tuscarawas County. And their meetings were held in my front hall over here, my front living room, when they first started their organization. Florence, and I have a picture of Florence Marsh sitting in the room right next to me from the 1920s. So I know what my house is, I look at it, but then I walk around my community and I say, oh, that's an interesting house. I'm fascinated in every house. I actually stay away from the houses of prominent, wealthy New Philadelphians, because honestly, I don't care about them. They've already been written about. You'll find them in books. I'm more interested in kind of the local histories. So that's kind of, it's either your house, maybe you've seen a house you're interested in, or maybe like me, you just see a house that's random and you say, you know what, I want to know who lived in that house. I want to know what their connection to the community was. Whatever your motivation for, doesn't really matter, but you got to start with a house. It's important to understand how the community in which that house exists developed over time, right? There are times when streets names change, house numbers change, town names change, right? You ever been to Navarre? You know, Navarre, it was actually 3 communities before it became Navarre. So you have to keep those things in mind. You have to keep in mind the fact that things change differently in urban settings than in rural settings, right? Oftentimes, whether your house is in a rural setting or an urban setting will really determine sometimes what kind of source you're going to use, okay? And what sources are going to be most useful to you. Skip. No, I didn't. Okay. So one of the things you do is, of course, our map resources, right? With your library card login, most of your libraries will allow you to log into the library version of Ancestry.com or Heritage, or their Heritage, they're the smaller tool. Most of those have those early county land map atlas records available to you, right? Those are very useful, particularly if you're looking at the ones in the 19th century, at identifying rural homes, right? Because they show a lot, they show property, they have the name of the person who owns the property. There's a little black square that's filled in where you know the house is, and there might be gardens around it. And then what you can do is you can then take that map, cross-reference that, right, with a modern Google satellite image of the area or Google satellite map, see where those roads relate. And most of the time, I've been very lucky, you can nail down, okay, this is where that house is, and that's that house. And then I've got that, so now I have at least that first owner, right? I have at least one name that I can use that I can then start to track from there to discover perhaps later owners, right? And you do that through the history side. You're in an urban area, right? And you might be lucky enough to have a Sanborn fire insurance map, right? The Library of Congress ones are the best because they're in color. There is also one available through the Ohio library systems. It's more of a photocopy image, so it's not nearly as clear as the ones on the Library of Congress. If you have the nice part about Sanborn fire insurance maps is they are done, in different years over time. And so oftentimes, if your house is on that map or the house you're researching is on that map, you can actually see how it develops over time. Right? You can see what changes happen to it physically. You can tell whether it's brick, stone, cement, wood frame, story and a half, 2-story. It might tell you what kind of shingles it has. It might tell you if there's an oven in the backyard, right? The Sanborn fire insurance maps can tell you an awful lot about the physical aspects of the house, right? Which are really, really helpful. There's some caution there, right? Oftentimes Sanborn fire insurance maps will give you numbers that look like street numbers or house numbers, and sometimes they are, right? But sometimes they're not correct. So you have to use the Sanborn fire insurance maps in combination with other tools, right? And use your deductive reasoning and your big brains to kind of determine where those houses sit on that list, right? And you can kind of cross-reference that with other sources. Of course, Google Maps is great. Like I mentioned, particularly if you're cross-referencing it with the county land maps, Google Earth is great. What's kind of neat about Google Earth is you can do 3-dimensional kind of perspective shots of it. It's not quite as clean, but it's good. Depending on the state you live in, your Department of Transportation or whatever it's called in your state may also have a number of their maps, their road maps, going back years on their website for you to access, right? So when you're cross-referencing with those older county land maps, if it's not gelling with what you're seeing on Google, you may want to go to your Department of Transportation maps and go to their website and see what maps they have for the years, perhaps, if it's available, of when your ancestor or the person you're researching. And so you can kind of coordinate those maps a little better. Visual resources, I already mentioned the county land maps that are available. If your family is particularly prominent, or if the house you're looking at is particularly prominent, in those 19th century county land maps particularly, it may actually show up either as a drawing of the houses in there or not. In Tuscarawas County, we have what's called a combination atlas from 1875 and 1908. And in that, the combination atlas has actually some photographs of houses from when they did the 1908 years. And those houses, sometimes they're fancy, sometimes they aren't. The opening image I gave you was for a rather modest house that shows up. Again, Sanborn fire insurance maps are wonderful, particularly when you cross-reference those with Google Maps to know the location of the property, where it got set up, and again, the development of that property over time and visual aspects. If none of you have ever used archive.org for county histories, you definitely need to use archive.org. The nice part about archive.org is they have lots and lots and lots of county histories, lots and lots and lots of newspapers, lots and lots and lots of other books that might be relevant for what you're looking at for your house. The county histories, if you might have a history of the family that you're looking at, they might even have the person. I've been lucky enough to have somebody actually mentioned in the county history. They might have an image of the house or an image of the property or an image of the block, just something to get you a look. I researched a house in Port Washington, Ohio, and was lucky enough to find images from a flood that occurred there in 1913 that showed the house. So I knew what it looked like in 1913 at least, and it hadn't changed dramatically from what it looked like when it was built. So those are options. We all are familiar with the Images of America books. This is a Tuscarawas County one. You've probably seen these. Oh, it's not going to do it. Right. A lot of times you might see images in there of the house you're researching. You might not. Nice part is if you search for those on Google Books, oftentimes you'll be able to find them, and they give you kind of previews of the book in most cases. And it won't be the whole book necessarily, but you might be able to go through that preview and get an idea of what your resources are in that book and whether it's worth trudging yourself to the library if you want to do that. A fairly recent one that is wonderful for rural, particularly looking at rural buildings, and particularly in Ohio, is a site called vintageaerial.com. Vintageaerial.com is exactly what it sounds like. It's a website where they have a database of photographs that have been taken over time, mostly in the 20th century, mostly going back from the 1950s up to the present. And they are black and white images that were taken as people did aerial surveys of parts of Ohio. And you will be able to find houses there that are particularly rural, because it's mostly looking at larger open areas. And you might be able to see what that house looked like, say, in 1960 or 1970 or 1980 or 1990, whenever these photographs were taken of that particular property. There's a wonderful house that I researched that is now gone. It was torn down last year, actually, between Bolivar and Canton, called I call it the Hickman House. It's the Hickman family that owned it. And I was able to find a wonderful image, well, several wonderful images of the Hickman House on Vintage Area that showed me its development from about 1960 up until about 2005. So I could see how buildings went away, showed up, came out, and torn down. So it's a really wonderful resource, again, particularly if you're looking at rural houses. Right. Name resources. Well, okay. I mentioned the county land maps, right? They can give you an idea of a name, because one of the things you're trying to do, right, is figure out who lived there. So the name is important. We've talked about the house, physically, where to look for it, all those things. But now we need to figure out a name. So the county land maps are great, again, for rural homes. Sometimes, most county land maps, when you get into smaller communities, if those communities existed then, will have smaller maps in there of those communities, and on there you might see names as well. When you get into cities like New Philadelphia, you're unlikely going to see the name of anybody on a lot. There's just too many lots, so you typically won't see that. City directories are available, of course, through ancestry.com and also through some other websites as well, including archive.org, depending on the city directory. Those are useful, and I'll show you how I use them when I get to my later kind of case study for you. And of course, census records after 1900 often will give you a house number. You have to be careful, again, both with city directories and with census records for house numbers, because these records are only as good as the people who wrote them down. And so sometimes, again, you have to go back to your physical resources, your visual resources, your maps, and use your deductive reasoning and cross-reference. Okay, there's 4 houses on this block. There's 4 houses on the block on the Sanborn map. The numbers on the Sanborn map aren't matching the numbers on the census record. Somebody's got it wrong. And so you have to kind of do your math and figure out deductively which house is which. But those are nice for getting names of people in the house. From that, from those name resources, and it's not on here, and using a library card, you can access, at least I can access newspaperarchive.com. You may be able to access that one or another one with your library. Once you have names, then you can start looking for real estate transfers, right, that are recorded in the newspaper. And so you can start searching those names in newspaper records to figure out when properties transfer, right? If you're in an urban area, it's very important to know what the lot number is. That often shows up on Sanborn maps. The lot number also often shows up on the county land maps when they show you a city, right? You'll see the lot numbers. So sometimes when you're having a hard time searching by a name, right, the name isn't coming up right, maybe because somebody didn't spell it correctly, maybe because they didn't do, it's some reason it's not showing up. You can sometimes also search those newspaper real estate transfers by lot number. And then you can kind of look at it that way as well. You kind of attack it from a couple of different angles. But the newspapers I've used newspapers a lot for tracking real estate transfers, right? the newspapers can also tell you a little about the history of the house in terms of maybe when it was built, right? If Fred Brown buys lot 49 for $100, and then 10, and if 2 years later sells it for $2,500, chances are he probably built the house, right? So you can use those things to kind of make deductive guesses about things. Of course, now once you want to flesh out the history of the site, to me that's the most fun part, right? Finding the names is fun and great and worthwhile, but I want to know what their lives were like when they lived in the house. I want to know the stories of what their lives were like when they were living in this house. Like I know, for instance, during the Depression, that Florence Marsh left bottles of milk on the back porch of my house so that poor kids could come and get milk. Right? That's not something I'm going to find out from a census record. I find that out from somebody reporting it in a newspaper, right? That Florence was doing. And so we start looking at things like county histories, which are, again, directing you to archive.org. I would also encourage you to do a name search on archive.org, Google, right? Put it in print, put it in quotes so that you're getting the exact search the metadata, right? That means it's going to search the whole document. And then sometimes you'll actually find out that so-and-so was part of a union, or was maybe a postman. He might have been doing any number of professional organizations he belonged to, right? Which will show up in those sources on archive.org that may not show up anywhere else. Of course, newspaper records we mentioned. Ancestry.com records, you'll see I have a caution there because Ancestry.com or any of these user submitted sites are only as good as the person who submitted them. And so in many cases, you have to use caution. If something you see on there does not gel, right, with what you have already researched in the process, then you know to ignore it, right? You know to let it go. But you have to be careful. Fold 3 is great, of course, for records of military service. Pensions are wonderful if you can find their pension records. It tells you, again, a lot about what their lives were like in the house when they're living there. I have a wonderful pension record for an ancestor of mine when they were living in Trenton, New Jersey, where my great grandmother ran off from my great grandfather, and my great grandfather went to the pension office, wrote a letter to them saying she's going to try to take his money, her father's money, right? So don't let her have it because we're going through a little rough patch now. So these are stories you get that you don't get from things like newspapers necessarily, or the regular records you look at. So pension records can often tell you an awful lot about the dynamics of a life in somebody's life. Find a grave is interesting. Again, huge caution with find a grave, but sometimes people are kind enough to post things like obituaries, right, for somebody on, which is very helpful. There's a family I was researching the other day, and I could not find the one woman died. I found her death certificate. She had burned to death, right? But I couldn't find her obituary, and it was at a time when the newspaper wasn't printing, so I couldn't find the story, right? So then I went to find a grave just as a lark to see, well, maybe I'll see if I can find her. And there somebody had actually typed in the newspaper account of her death, right? That had actually appeared in a newspaper that wasn't available to me. So sometimes those are good resources. Again, you just have to use caution. If you really want to know what happened, she was 73 years old. She went to light the gas stove and her dress caught on fire and she burned to death. And this was in the 1930s. So it wasn't even like it was, in the 1800s. County auditor records are great, right? The nice part about county auditor records is theoretically, they know what they're talking about. Again, you have to use caution though. A lot of times they will give you the when a house was built, but they're wrong. Or you'll discover as you do your research that there's no way that house was built when the auditor says it. The case study I'm going to show you here in a minute, actually the date gels, which is unusual, but just important to know that they're not always correct. As with any resource, y'all are smart, use caution. Now, if you're like me, you don't want to just know about the house and physically when it was built, who was living. You also want to know, what was the style, how did it fit with the rest of its community. That tells you a lot about the community as well. For instance, like when the community was being developed. If you walk around New Philadelphia, you'll see an enormous amount of Italianate houses, Italianate architectural style. Well, that makes sense. It was happening in a specific period in time when New Philadelphia was kind of booming. So everybody's doing the latest fashion of house. Now you look around, you're like, well, they all look the same. So it sounds like your average neighborhood today, right? When they build houses and they all look alike. Wasn't much different back in the 1870s in New Philadelphia. Everybody's throwing up in time. There are architecture books on archive.org you can look through. There are house plans even. Sometimes you'll even see house plans from the era where you can actually say, wow, it gives you a floor plan. Occasionally, again, the auditor site, county auditor site, will usually have what they call a sketch. And the sketch gives you the footprint of the house, square footage, what different things are, the screened-in porches, open porches, things like that. The Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, of which I am a graduate in a way, has a wonderful website where they provide information on all these different architectural styles that were common in Pennsylvania, which, newsflash, they're just as common in Ohio. So you can use their site. It tells you kind of basic kind of styles that you should look for, details of the particular architectural style. If you don't, if you're really into architecture and houses, then you want this book, which is The Field Guide to American Houses. I have my copy, which is all dirty and nasty all the time. That is really the Bible of those of us who like to study architecture, particularly American vernacular architecture. Well worth the purchase if you're really going to get into wanting to know an awful lot about your house and style and maybe when it was built. So we're going to do a little case study. All right, it's been a half an hour. So we're getting to that. So this is a house. You don't get impressed by this house, right? Like I said, I don't look at houses. I don't like to research fancy houses because, again, those people were all wealthy at the time. They're in a history book somewhere, so their lives are already pretty well known. I think we all know how wealthy people lived, whether it's back then or not. So I want to know more about these folks. I call this the Brown House because that's the one I'm researching with it. This house sits on a West Front Street in New Philadelphia, on the corner of West Front and 6th, what is today 6th. So nothing fancy, it's an American. Just looking at it, I can tell you it's an American folk vernacular house, common, in the 1890s, 1900s, when timber could be brought in by rail easily, and people were throwing up these houses. A typical standard working man's house. It was never ever this big. So now I have to get out of this. I want to get out of this and that show. And now I'm going to share something else with you. Okay. So resources, right? All the resources you see here on this screen are about this house. All of these resources came from various online sources, right? So I knew where the house sat, right? I knew it sat at the corner at what is today West Front and 6th Street. So because I know my community and I know the street names changed, what I did was I went to my Library of Congress website and I looked up the Sanborn maps for the city of New Philadelphia. There's about 8 of them, I think, for New Philadelphia. The earliest one is 1887. The most recent one, I think, is 1926. And so I said, well, looking at that house, I know kind of the architectural style. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at 1901. So why do I pick 1901? I'll tell you why. Because if it's there, great. If it has a house number, even better. And then I also know that there's a census a year earlier, right? So now it's a lot easier for me to nail down a name if I look at a map around the same time as when I know I can find it. So I pull up the 1901 Sanborn map. All right, for that particular area. And if you look, I'm zooming in, and there it is, right here, right? So there's the house. So I knew it existed in 1901, which makes sense.
We're not seeing it, Noel.
Oh, okay, hold on. Did it not show that? Why is it not showing?
We're still seeing your directory.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to show you this. Okay, I want to show. Oh, it wants me to. Okay, hold on. It wants me to change my screen. Sorry about that, folks. Give me 1 second. I want to show you this. Okay. Well, let me just go from one window. Okay, so here we are. Do you see that now? Okay.
That's good.
Okay, so there it is, sitting there in 1901. Right, so I know it's sitting there in 1901, which is nice. And I can kind of see faintly that there's a number in there, right? Which looks like 601. And that's what it is. But only because I know it. So there it is, sitting. You'll also notice up here, right? There's a couple of houses up here. Here's 130, 138, right? And that's now what can I tell from this? Well, you'll see that it's a one-story, looks like it's supposed to be a one-story wood frame house, right? So now I know that's not my house, right? My house I know is 2 stories. So something's changed, or again, the Sanborn maps. So so now it was 1901. So what I do next is I say, well, 1901, let's look at what I know is available to me through Ancestry.com and my library card, which is the city directories for New Philadelphia. There are 3 of them: 1903, 1907, 1921. 1903 is closest to 1900, right? I'm getting close to that census record. I'm trying to make sure I can nail down my name. And I look here, and I see that there is a Fred Brown and Margaret Brown, right? But they're living at 138, which is that other little house, right? So I can't see any person living in my house in 1903 was a gentleman named Niedermeyer, right? But I know when I look at the 1907 one for New Philadelphia, I see Fred Brown is now living. Fred Brown is living in my house. Now it's saying 603, which was the actual house number, and it had always been 603. So the Sanborn map was off, and it shows up 603 later. So he's now living there, this guy, Fred Brown. So now I have to figure out, when did Fred Brown get this house? Well, I know he wasn't there in 1903, and I know he's there in 1907. So he obviously acquired the property sometime between 1903 and 1907. I go back to the auditor's records. I'm gonna go real quick to my auditor's records. Bear with me. There we go. Okay, so this is the auditor record for this listing, right? Which is still called 603. And it lists the construction of the house is 1890, right? Which kind of fits with what I'm trying to do. Let's see here. So now I've got a name. I've got this Fred Brown. So next thing I'm going to do is I need to find out who Fred Brown was. And again, you have to use your deductive history brain for this, which means you have to figure out if he's owning a house, right, in 1907. He's not a little kid, right? And so we know he's got a certain age to him. So we look for the census records for a Frederick. I looked for in the 1900 census records for a Frederick Brown. Oh, you're gonna make me go back. I gotta go through my other one. Sorry. So I go to the 1900 census for Fred Brown. There he is. So here's Frederick Brown, living where I thought he would be living. Just remember, he's not living at my house yet. He's living on 9th Street. So there he is. There's his wife Margaret and their son Harry. And I get his birth date, right? Well, now great. Now I can figure out who he actually is. I do my next search, and then what I discover from Fred Brown is that he's the son of a gentleman named Nicholas Brown, right? Who was a farmer in Auburn Township in the 19th century. Nicholas came to us from Switzerland. Stop doing it. All right. So now I'm like, okay, he came from us from Switzerland, and I figured that, okay, good enough. Well, here he is. Here's Nicholas and his wife Maria coming over in 1863, which is when he came over through New York from Switzerland. He came to Tuscarawas County. He's in Tuscarawas County by 1870. He's working in an ore mine when he first arrives. This is him on the 1870 census with Maria. Rosina, there's my guy Frederick. All right, so now I know Frederick is the son of this gentleman, Nicholas, a Swiss immigrant. I know he has siblings. Then I go to my county maps, right? Remember my county maps? This is the 1875 county map for Auburn Township. Well, guess what? There's Nicholas Brown, right? There's Nicholas Brown's property in Auburn Township, his farm. This gets confirmed later after Nicholas Brown's death. Frederick, my Fred Brown, who lives in that little house I showed you, he actually puts an ad in the newspaper to rent this farm out, right? So we know that we've got our connection to Nicholas Brown, and we've got our history. 1880, we've got Frederick still. This is Frederick Brown. This is when he got married to Alice Cook in Tuscarawas County. So now I know I've got their marriage records. I've got that together. So now I need to start looking at his life, right? I know who he is. I know roughly when he bought the house or got into the house. So now we can start looking at his life. Right. So here's a little, and that's when we get into our newspaper articles. Mr. and Mrs. Fred Brown on 9th Street. Remember, they're not in the house until 1907. This is in 1904, 5. This is 1901. Mr. and Mrs. Fred Brown on 9th Street are elated over the arrival of a little girl Saturday morning. Right. So now we know they've had a child. We've got them in this. Here we know now this is where it starts to get really interesting for him. This is a reference to Fred Brown buying part of lot 39. This should be Hugo's edition, New Philadelphia, for $50, right? So he's buying a portion of lot 39, which is right next door to the lot that the house we're talking about sits on, for $50. Tells you there's nothing there, an empty parcel, only $50. Now we have him in 1907, and we know he's living in that house on Front Street. Then we get the death of his father, Nicholas Brown, 1908. This is Nicholas's will, where he leaves stuff to his son. Again, all these resources are available to you with a library card, right? So this is all Nicholas's will. He mentions Frederick is the executor of his estate. We come to 1910. We're looking for the Browns again. Oh, there they are. So there's Frederick, Margaret, Annie, Harry. Harry's 17 now. He's working in the steel mill. What we discover both from the directory records and from these census records in these areas, we know that our Fred Brown, my Fred Brown guy I'm writing about, is working in the steel mill. He's working at the sheet tin plant and steel mill here in New Philadelphia. That's his job, right? So he's a working class guy. So then we start looking at later Sanborn maps to see the development of the house. So here we are again. This is now the 1910 Sanborn map, right? Now you can look. Now what we're looking at is two-story house. We've got the additions started, which we know are on the house from the other image I showed you. It's got a nice partial front porch over the main doorway. Again, very straightforward, single-story additions, two-story dwelling house. So it's developing. Still listed incorrectly at 601. There is no 603 on the Sanborn. Then we see the one ad. This is after the death of his father, right? He's renting out his father's farm in Auburn Township. You want to talk to him? You see Fred Brown, 603 West Front, right? Where Fred's living, and his wife. Then we have the marriage of his son. We know that his son eventually gets married. He moves to Niles, where he goes to work in another steel mill. So his son follows in his footsteps. There's a lot of references to his son coming back with his wife, or just his wife would come back and visit the Browns in their small house on Front Street. And then we just keep kind of going along, trying to trace their lives, right? Using the records that we always are familiar with using. So here we are, confirming all this stuff. He's still working in the steel mill in the 1920s. I think it's interesting when you consider, where Fred is coming from. He's getting older and he's still working in the steel mills, no retirement. Here's Fred Brown again. This is in the 1921 directory. There he is, just calls him a mill worker. He's still working, right? This is Harry Brown and now their daughter Evelyn. So now I know the grandkids are running around the house, right? I've got, like any of our homes, we now know that this house is getting grandkids in it. We find out that that Fred was a member of the Maccabees, right? Which is a social organization, social club here. He was actually elected to a position in the organization, which tells you he's likely respected in his community for being, a well-known, well-respected man. This is the death of his wife. Oh no, this is his mother's death when she passes away. And now we're in the 1926 map. Let's take a look at his house now. All right, now it's almost identical to what it looks like today, right? You're seeing that large one-story addition has now been completely encompasses the back part of the house. Second story, front end. Now the porch is running all the way across the front of the house, not just in front of the doorway. So it's been changing over time. He starts to rent. Now, after the death of his mother, what I didn't tell you is, at some point, Fred Brown's mother, Fred Brown acquires this house right next door, right here. And his mother's living there. After the death of his mother, he starts to rent it out, right? He starts renting out her house. And then he starts going into business making glass nameplates at his house for some reason, right? So now we know Fred Brown's a bit of an entrepreneur in his old age, right? Probably trying to find a way to make a little extra money while he's getting older and can't necessarily. 1930 census, Fred's still hanging in there. There he is, down here at the bottom. Now we also know, because you'll see this in census records as well, he owns his house, right? These are all things you all know if you've done census records. Owns his house, value of the house is $2,500, not bad. He's 64, right? Is he working? No. So he's not working except making glass nameplates. There he is again, renting out the house. And then and he dies dies in 1932. Fred Brown is dead. His wife, Margaret, continues to live in the house. 1940s, 1950s. She lives in the house until she dies in 1957. Right. So the house was in their family for 50 years, over 50 years. So when you look at the houses, right, when we start to look, this, whoops, sorry about that. This house, remember I mentioned that they lived in that house just up the street from the corner? This is that house. This was the house they lived in before they moved into this one. Now you can see these additions on the back, how they mirror what we saw on the Sanborn map. Right. Now the porch at one point ran all the way across the front here. That's an ugly picture. There it is again, saying there's additions. So all of these resources readily available to you online with a library card. And by starting with a house, sometimes it's a nice way to get into a person, right? Or if you have the person, you can find the house. But researching house histories is not as difficult as you might imagine. You just have to know where to start. And for me, I tend to start with maps and city directories. That's kind of the best place for me to start. And let me go to my again. Can't see any of my menus. All right. So that's kind of how I do it and what I do to do research for a house history. If you're interested, I'm going to try something else for you. I do on my website, try something else if you'll bear with me. Okay. I'm going to share the screen here real quick so I can show you something. If you go to my website, which is noelpoirier.com, I have an actual article on my website called "How I Do It," because whenever I write these stories and I post them, inevitably I get asked, "How do you do it? Where do I get started?" Or I want to research my house. And so what I try to do is on this page is give you a lot of information, some links to those resources directly that can tell you where you can find one. I constantly tell you get a library card in this article. So it's a regular thing that I do. But it gives you an idea of how you can go about kind of starting on a house history and trying to figure out where to get started. It paraphrases essentially what we've talked about. So that is the end of my talk. If you have a question, feel free. Oh, I want to put the website. Yes, I will do that. I'm getting a question about the website. I'll do it right now. Okay. Well, the P isn't capitalized. And you can go to my website. You can read some of the house histories that I've written for my community and for the areas, as well as about my own house. So, feel free to check it out. Any questions, or are we all done? You can unmute yourself if you'd like and ask a question.
I have 2 questions for you, actually.
Sure.
Thank you for the presentation. One was for the wills. Which resource are you using to find the wills?
Okay, for the wills, I use my library card, which provides me access to Ancestry Library online, and then I can go into their wills section. I do not do this. I almost never use search features on any of these sites. I tend to go look at the images, the raw images themselves, particularly if I know the time frame I'm looking at. So I tend to do it that way.
Okay, and thank you. The other question was about the newspapers. So when you're searching those, like you just go in, you just have to go read it, right? You can't like search, right? Like
No, you can do a search.
okay.
Newspaperarchive.com has what they call all the word search or an exact search. You have to be careful again with a lot of the names.
Yeah.
Because the newspapers are notoriously bad at spelling people's names. And that's why sometimes knowing the lot number is really helpful, particularly in an urban area, because they usually don't get that wrong, but they can misspell the name. I had a family name, it was the Schauflers, so you can imagine how that got spelled in the newspaper over 40 years. So you have to almost search for every one of those things. But typically, again, if you start doing your research on the house, and a lot of times once you get an eye for it, you can get an idea of when a house was built, like within 10 years or so. It helps narrow down your newspaper search, and hopefully your community has a newspaper for that.
Yeah, well, I live in Richland County, and they
Okay.
have them at the Mansfield Library, but
Sure.
you can't search them. You just
Okay.
it's microfiche digitized, so you just have to go and read them all.
Yeah, that's a nightmare. You might be able to access some of them through other resources that may not be available through your library card. If you're in Mansfield, you certainly should take advantage of the OGS library, where we have access to a lot of databases, the full-size databases that can get you a little more information.
Can I ask one more? I don't want to
Sure.
hog all the time, but
That's okay.
okay, so I have this one land transfer that I can't make sense of. It's in 1933, and it goes from the husband, his wife, and his sister to some person we don't know, J.W. Smith, like in all in the same year, and then it
Right.
goes back to the wife. So it's husband, wife, sister, this weird guy we don't know.
Right.
And was there ever like, is it like a business or something, like a purpose for that?
It could be. There could be a legal reason they did that, which was to protect the property.
I was thinking, yeah.
So you might have to look in actual court documents to figure out what was going on there.
Like
Sometimes I found a lot of court records where the husband, the very prominent husband, puts everything in his wife's name, even in the 19th century and early 20th century. So just to shield the property from any other action.
Got it. All right, thank you.
No, thank you. Nothing else? Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, this is
Hi.
Anne.
Hi,
Hi.
Ann.
Thank you for everything all this information today. Do you have any special comments regarding researching Civil War houses that were built during that period?
Nothing specific. The records aren't always as great. My house in Wrightsville, Pennsylvania, when I lived there, was built in 1861. And I was able, through again maps of that area that were available to me in Pennsylvania, to make determinations about that it was physically there at a certain time. A lot of those records, you're online, you're not going to necessarily find them. Those are going to be deed. You're going to have to look at deeds.
Right.
Yeah,
So you really pretty much have to go to the community records.
Or you have to find someone who can do that for you.
Right.
It's the newspapers weren't as extensive in the 1860s in terms of covering those things, unless you're in a big city where they might do that. But for the most part, when you're getting early 1860s or earlier, unless you've got a map or something like that that'll help guide you, you're gonna have to do a lot more legwork.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Like I can give you an example. Like for my house, I only know that my house was built in about 1853. And I know that because the gentleman who bought the lot in 1851 or whatever, bought it for nothing basically. And then he turned around and sold it in 1853 or 54 for about $4,000. So,
wow.
So it went from having nothing on it to being worth $4,000, which pretty well nailed down when the house was built. And the architectural style of the house all fit with it. So you have to look kind of at all the clues that go along with it.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and end it now. Hopefully the webinar will be on the website here shortly in the next few days, and I will put a link to the PowerPoint on that page if that's possible.
You have a couple in the chat.
Something in the chat. All right, let me look. I live in Arizona, research Elmore and Groton Township, Ohio. Can I get a library card to local libraries? Wow. Probably not, but you should be able to get a local library card where you are, and that should still provide you access to those same resources. It's not an exclusively Ohio feature of public library. I would encourage you to go ahead and get if you have one in your local library, you should still be able to access them. That was for Kay in Arizona, I believe. You got them all?
Kathy, our family farm is in a rural area, and I've traced the land back to the owners, back to Connecticut Land Company, but I don't know when the house or barn was built. Any suggestions?
Let's look at this. Well, I'll be honestly, the best way to determine that would be to try to find, it would be to look at the art. I mean, in general, I would say look at the architectural style of the house. That'll narrow you down to about 20 years, right? And that might give you a start. There are certain houses that went in and out of fashion, styles that went in and out of fashion in a very short amount of time. So it'd be interesting to see what the house looks like to understand the architectural style. If it's a certain architectural style, we can usually nail down within 20 years, and then that gives you a place to start.
How can you find information about bridges and who built them in your area?
Good question. Not a bridge building guy. What I will say is, I know, for instance, in New Philadelphia, whenever someone undertook a public project like a bridge, even in the 1800s, it gets reported in the newspaper. So oftentimes you'll know that from a newspaper account that someone's been undertaking a bridge. There was a gentleman I researched for another project named William Heron, who was a painter by trade, and when he was painting bridges, it shows up in the newspaper. It was William Heron has been contracted to paint so and so trestle bridge. But construction I would assume you'd find that bridges are pretty important. That would be my first track, quite frankly, to look at these. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate everybody coming out and spending some time with us today. I'm going to end the meeting now, and I look forward to doing another talk with you. Next month, Linda Swanson, who is our librarian at OGS, will be giving a talk on digitizing our collections and what's involved in that process, because it's a woefully misunderstood process, and she wants to kind of illuminate people on what goes into what we do when we digitize. So thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.